Hi everyone, welcome back to Class 101. Bryce Coe here, and today I'll be demoing for you a variety of different lighting schemes just to show you how a different lighting setup can create different moods and tones, which should be very helpful for you guys in your illustrations going forward. Okay, so for materials, we're going to be using the Pentel watercolor brush pen with the fine tip. That's the one with the darkest blue cap. The Kuretake felt pen with the extra fine tip, just really briefly. And I've set aside a couple colors here. I have number 44 yellow ochre and number 50 malachite. And one tip that I noticed the other day when I was putting these away is if you ever kind of set these aside and kind of forget where to put them back in the original kind of position, the back of the palette has a number on it, so you can kind of just match that up with the number that's kind of displayed on the box itself. Okay, so a couple more things. Also make sure that you have, a spare paper towel to blot out any mistakes that you make, and to have a piece of scratch paper so that you can test your water values as you're painting. Lastly, we also have a couple drawings today from previous chapters. We're going to start out with this drawing from chapter 2 lesson 1 about rhythm. We just drew some faces here, so I think these would just be some good samples for how to demo some lighting schemes. And with that, let's get started. So I'm going to start by doing that same practice of kind of doing a demo of a ball under each of these to kind of just do a really quick sample of what the lighting scheme is before we apply it to the actual face. And we can give this guy one too. Okay, the idea for these two colors is that each one of these is going to represent a different light source. This one may be more of the normal light shadow, and then this one kind of more of a secondary, more of a highlight type of shadow. So we're going to start out with the yellow ochre. Load up my brush. And for this first one, I just want to kind of have the base kind of more simple lighting scheme, pretty similar to what we've done in the previous lessons, where it's just kind of a very typical lighting scheme that is one point and kind of more flattering. It's what you'd see most of the time on a drawing, unless the drawing has like a really intense kind of scene going on. So light coming from this direction. So the things to look out for on the face are giving form to that chin by putting a cast shadow essentially from the chin onto the neck, and some shadow under the hair. Giving form to this hair blob and saying that it's kind of more of a spherical shape by doing a cross contour along it, shading that in. And you can, I got a little bit too much value on there, but what you can do as well is kind of use this as a chance to define this form a little bit more, maybe make this hair have some parts of it that the strands are a bit sticking out more. Underside of that hair here. And you can see this right now, that because the water is sitting on top of the page, that the pigment is also kind of obscuring the ink a little bit. That's going to eventually soak into the page, so don't worry about it like standing out so much. But if you prefer to take off some of that liquid by pulling it away, you can do that as well. I'm going to let it sit just to let you guys see that it will eventually soak in. And this could be pretty much it for this first scheme. The thing that we can do though is we can actually create or strengthen some of the forms that aren't really drawn in yet. So I'm talking about the fact that she doesn't really have too many facial features like lips or a nose. So we can decide to do that now in the shading process, or if this is what we, the aesthetic we wanted to go with, we could leave it. I'm going to keep going just to show what's possible. Okay, so thinking about the nose as a 3D shape, it's a little bit of, in her case, probably just shaped like this, where the shadow is going to well, the light is going to hit the top plane of the nose, and then the side plane of the nose is going to be in shadow, and the cast shadow from the tip of the nose landing on the face as well. So just thinking of this as a shape. And also going to give her a little bit more form to the side plane of her face. So this right here would be kind of where her cheekbone ends. And this is a Terminator line that I'm drawing just because before I fill it in, I kind of just wanted to figure out what that form was. That's kind of the diagram line that we did previously on the cheek. I often do that when shading a face from this scheme because it's really helpful to kind of separate the front plane from the side plane. Now filling that in. Side plane of the neck now. Some extra value as I was touching some of these more wet spots, though now having to spread it out a little bit. Okay, so that's lighting scheme number one. Now I'm going to do a more intense lighting scheme on this guy from a completely top-down point of view. And let's just demonstrate what we're going to do here first. So that's what I'm thinking for the major light source. And then for the kind of bounce light, I actually think that maybe, if the light was bouncing off of like grass or like a really green carpet or malachite colored carpet, then the light source would not only be brighter down there at the bottom of the object, but would have a little bit of a tint of that color as well. So the idea with this scheme is that it's really hotly lit from the top, and that the color of that bounce light is actually a different color. So I'll start with the yellow ochre. And I'm kind of just, because the hair is rough on the top, the cross contour along the top plane is also pretty messy. Doesn't need to be a very clean line. Of course, you can still draw in a Terminator line that's really clean if you prefer. I just kind of trying to match the quality of lines that are here. And I'm going to create an additional plane to these glasses by leaving this white highlight here. That's kind of giving them a top edge and saying that top edge is lit versus the side plane of these glasses, which is not. And I'm choosing to kind of fade out this color because I'm thinking about how I eventually want to pull in some of this bounce light here. So leaving room for that. This is all in shadow because it's kind of flat. It's just like the side plane of those glasses, really. And the one thing that his face can have a little bit more form to is the top of his nose. So his nose is, you know, I mean, with these characters, they all kind of have a very, very basic baby nose. But the top plane of his nose is going to be lit versus the underside of it is not. So if you think about this shape that we drew previously, it's almost like this being the shape that only the top portions of it are lit. And as it goes under, you know what, actually I kind of take that back. This might not be super accurate. I think it's something more like, if this is the nose, the part that sticks out the most from coming out from the face will catch the most light. So just like the tip of the nose would get some light, and then the underside of the nose would fall into shadow. So that's what I'm going to do here. Where I can kind of just shade all the planes except for the part of the nose that's coming forward. And likewise for like his cheeks, if those came forward a little bit, they would catch light, but the rest of the cheek that's kind of the form as it's going in wouldn't catch as much light. Alright, so now switching over to the malachite here. And with the malachite, it's almost like I'm just changing the color of my shadow here and thinking about a light source coming from below. For the bottom plane of the chin, I think that is lit, so I'm kind of drawing a terminator line around the area that I want to keep pristine. A little bit too much value, or a little bit too much water. Still too much water. In this case, it might be a little bit annoying, so I'm just going to dab it a little bit. And as these light sources kind of combine, I'm just going to gradually color over the previous, or the other light shadow here, or light source. Some of the light that is coming from below would actually catch the bottom plane of the nose, and likewise could hit the bottom part of his glasses. And this is kind of touching on something that we haven't quite gotten to yet to this point, which is that so far we've been drawing shadow and revealing light as the page, you know, the whiteness of the actual paper. but it's also possible to use color to represent the light as well. So that is this scheme where there's a light source above and a reflected light source below. Let's do an example over here that kind of can more easily kind of demonstrate what I was talking about with a highlight being conveyed through watercolor. So for this guy, I'm saying that he's got kind of like not necessarily a shadow, but a blue rim light on the edges of the character. And on the other side, maybe a different colored highlight. So he's kind of like normally lit in the middle, and then two different colored light sources on each side. So on this side, flow is a little bit intense today. So on this side, I'm kind of hitting him with yellow light source. And the way that I'm thinking about doing this is kind of like almost the opposite of the way that we've been shading this way, where now I am using pigment to portray the light itself. Show where the shadow is. So right here, I kind of want to show the side plane a bit better and go all the way up into his kind of the turn of the face here where his cheekbone is. And then on this side, same idea, but with a different colored light source. So this is kind of the highlight. And what's great with this color that I've chosen is that this is the one I mentioned previously, is more opaque. So when it sits on top of ink, it actually will be able to stay there a little bit better. It won't be as bright as it is right here. It eventually will sink in or soak in, but it will show up a little bit, and then you can kind of use that to your advantage to think of this color as being really useful for highlighting purposes. So it's kind of like I'm shading in the side plane that is away from us, so very little of it to see here. But you'll see that this is a pretty common scheme in drawings where they just kind of want to give the character what's called a hair light to just kind of like make them pop out from a background. So if he had some like darker shapes behind him, this hair light would reveal the outer contour of that head shape. And from this side, what would be good about this highlight is that it would also reveal this side of the nose. His nose sticks out, so it would catch some of that secondary light source. And maybe just a tip of that bottom lip. Okay, so that is a character with two light sources, one on the right in the malachite and one on the left in the yellow ochre. And this is more of painting in highlights as opposed to painting in shadows. And for this last one, I want to show you one that I think comes up a lot. It's kind of just like backlit. We did something pretty similar in the previous class with the Viking, where the majority of the character is in shadow, and the highlight, like we painted in here, is going to just be revealed by the absence of the shadow. We can say that that is entirely that color, and then I'm going to come back at this with a secondary color to kind of show that, kind of like with this one, we can add in a different quality of light with our reflected light using a different color. Okay, so this guy's pretty simple, not too much hair or anything to kind of complicate this. I'll draw in kind of the Terminator here. And thinking about here the shape of his eyelids, and that can be kind of tricky sometimes, so the more dominant shape that I am going to move to is his nose, because I know similarly to this one, almost like the inverse of that drawing, I want to have a highlight on the nose there. But that here on the cheek, that this cheekbone here, which is like, you know, defining the edge of this front plane, which is going to be in shadow, that is going to catch some of the shadow versus the nose. All right. Then a little bit of a cast shadow on the neck from the head there. And now over here is maybe a more clear chance to kind of think about, maybe around here his eyelid might catch some of that light. And because, I don't know, it just might be my own way of thinking of it, but now that I kind of more clearly understand how I want to handle it here on this side, where it got a little bit more complicated because I wanted to reserve some space for the nose, I'm now thinking a little bit more clearly that that doesn't need to interact with this part of the eyelid. It can be separate. So now I'm just going to fill these in, and filling them in after drawing those Terminators will create some interesting dynamics with the watercolor. Essentially, because we drew lines ahead of time, the paint that we used to draw those outlines has sat for longer and will just have a different quality to it, maybe be a little bit darker than this second pass of color that we're using to fill it in. Sometimes it'll blend in. It just depends on how much pigment is on your brush and how you kind of move it around. I'm going to pull off some of my pigment here because I want to pull down this more intense amount of color until it fades out, because the next thing I'm thinking about is adding a second quality of color to the bounce light. And in the future, I did not think of this, but one thing you might do if you're like me and you're kind of wanting to save some of that color, you might also just have a second watercolor brush pen on hand that's one's loaded with one color and one's loaded with another color. Just remember to clean your brushes at the end of the day so that you can release some of that pigment off of them and not let it sit on the brush too long. Okay. So I am choosing to put some yellow here as kind of altering the quality of that reflected light. So we're still coloring within a shadow here, but we're saying that that bounce is making the light turn a little bit more yellow. Maybe he's sitting above like a really like kind of low fire over here. Brush a little dirty, but that's okay. That's kind of the blended color that we'll get. And I just want to mention that sometimes I use the word bounce to refer to the reflected light. That's just because that's what it's called in film, which is something that I used to be involved with. So it's because in the film industry they might have like a whiteboard on the floor to bounce up the light source from the actual light, just to kind of create this effect. So that's what bounce light means. Okay, so this is the backlit highlight scheme with a different quality of light on the reflected light. And for this last one, why don't we try doing something a little bit more intense? I'm thinking, let me see. I think that one of the things that you guys kind of have some experience with already is, drawing cross contours along a form. And one of the ways that that often happens is, if a character is standing next to some blinds. So the fact that like the blinds are going to block out some of the light because that's what they're supposed to do, but that some of the light will go through the blinds onto the character. That is the basic idea here. So this is one that's really good for testing our knowledge of the form, because we're going to have to draw a cross contour that goes all the way along it. So if I were to just draw a line that goes straight across here, but I'm thinking that the light source is coming down at this angle. So basically this line wrapped along this form is mostly flat on this front part here, but then as it comes to the turn of the face here, it's going to become more harsh as that light kind of has to bend along the side of the face. And my pen is a little bit too loaded, too much water. This is one of those instances where you're going to kind of have to be forced to reconcile with the fact that, you've drawn an image and spent a lot of time making it look good, but the light is the light. You can't really be precious with the fact that, like, oh, this part of the eye is going to be in shadow. You can't like really alter that to show the eyeball when it just happens to be in shadow. For this example, you do have a chance to kind of decide which of these areas is going to be in shadow, as far as like, okay, now you've drawn the cross contours along the face, now you're going to decide which of these is the light coming through and which of these is the blind blocking the light. So if we wanted this eyeball to be lit, then that means that we could just say that the part of this that's in shadow is alternating starting with this one. And we've started with drawing these cross contours along the face to kind of help us understand how the light would bend along the face. But one thing that we still need to do is now shade it like normal, and so the side plane of this face probably would not catch that light. That light might like actually land back here somewhere. Same with this part here. And for the nose. A lot of these decisions we kind of made in the drawing process. The shading that we did with our kind of like really brief foray into cross hatching kind of helped to reveal that this was the side plane of the nose. Just evening out my value here. All right, and so that is another example of a lighting scheme that I think is pretty fun to play with. You can do a similar thing with like dappled lighting or any kind of intense shadow. So like if a shadow from a window or something cuts across the face, that can be a really cool way to shade a character and can make it look really dramatic as well. All right, so that's pretty much it for these examples. So for these next examples, we're going to be using some of the drawings we did in Chapter 3, Lesson 6, when we practiced drawing the human face. And let's just get into a couple more examples of lighting schemes. So I'm just going to draw a couple more balls for us to plan out our lighting scheme. Okay, so for this next example, I'm going to be doing a lighting scheme that kind of matches some of the lines we drew previously, just to not fight with our original lines. Some of these cross contours are really determining our light scheme, which might be something for you guys to consider as well anytime you are shading a drawing, that you might have locked in some decisions by using some of these lines. So in this case, I'm talking about the turn of the face here, really separating these two things. So what my thinking is that it's more difficult to do a lighting scheme where this would not be part of it. So in that case, I'm thinking that she's kind of side lit here. So her front face is going to be mostly in shadow, but I'm also going to give her a highlight on the side here. And think about this malachite color being an additional light source that blends in to our main light source that's coming from the side there. To blot this out because my pen is going crazy. So kind of have the Terminator line drawn already with this contour line going across the face. So I will follow that line. And the things I'm thinking about here are the the various forms on the face here. So the lip kind of being a shape that's coming out, having to draw a cross contour along it to know where the light would hit it. If you kind of take it easy and don't think very intensely about what each of these shapes are, it'll make it really difficult to know where to shade and what to leave as a highlight. So when you think of something like the nose, you do need to think of it as a 3D shape. So that I'm drawing some Terminator lines here to show that the light might hit that side plane. And side plane of this neck versus, I'm sorry, this might be considered the front plane of the neck, and this would be the side that is getting lit. Very similar to what would happen with the cast shadow from the head hanging over it, but actually only this tiny bit right here would be part of the cast shadow. The rest of this is in shadow just because it's facing away from the light source. Thinking about the form of the ear, we have to understand the 3D form here to know that the side of the ear is actually going to be lit, but the kind of portion of the ear that is connecting into the head is actually facing away from that light. It's not like a completely flat shape that's flush against the head, so the fact that this part sticks out a little bit will put it in shadow. Similarly for the hair, most of the hair is going to get lit from this angle, but some of it, as it's turning away or getting covered by other pieces of hair, that might increase the number of shadows you could see on the side there. You can add additional shapes and forms at this point as well. And the underside plane here of the hair also would be in shadow. So everything that I'm determining, I'm using my understanding of those 3D shapes to let me know what planes are facing that direction. That understanding really being kind of the key to the way that we can understand how to shade something. So those eyes here would also be in shadow, and this is maybe a clear example of what I was trying to pinpoint in the previous lesson, where you can say that the eye is mostly in shadow, but maybe just a tiny bit of the side plane of the eye here could catch a little bit of that light source. So by being really sparing with the amount of light that you allow to hit it, you can make a really cool highlight there. So putting everything in shadow, but just a tiny little bit on the eye will make the lighting scheme not only more realistic because the eye wouldn't be like just glowing, but that little bit of highlight will strengthen can kind of create its own unique way to make the drawing interesting. This eye doesn't get any of that highlight though. Okay, so now I want to paint with light. We've been using the watercolor to kind of paint the shadow, but on this side now I want to say, like, okay, in addition to this white light, there's also some sort of really blue or kind of teal light on that side too. So now I am, as opposed to leaving space for the light to be bright and white, I am painting in a really thin highlight of what this kind of other light source might hit. One of the things that I also want to mention about this process is that it's kind of a combination of understanding the form, which I would consider kind of like a really like scientific, almost math-like approach to understanding the hardcore physics of how this light is coming from this angle and bouncing off forms or what have you. And that the other part of this process is aesthetic. And it's just about choosing where to create aesthetically pleasing shapes and where to kind of reveal, maybe more in a story-oriented way, what your drawing is about. So, for example, this is, just a demo of something, but to kind of make this more interesting and to highlight the character more so than just the lighting scheme, one of the things that you might do is use our secondary kind of highlight color and highlight something like the eyes. That was too much pigment, but you might do that once you have the correct amount of pigment on your brush to pull the viewer's attention towards what you want them to actually look at. So because you mostly want to look at a person's face and the eyes being kind of the most interesting feature, having a separation of material for the pupil using the same color as a highlight color is one of those ways where it doesn't have anything to do with what we've been learning about lighting, strictly speaking, but that it does happen to be part of that artistic process of choosing where to put highlights, when sometimes that doesn't have to do with the lighting scheme, but just how we want the drawing to feel and to draw the audience's attention to certain parts. Okay, so now moving on to our male character. I actually want to use him to demonstrate something that I feel like I've kind of just neglected because it's kind of a more basic idea, but we've been previously till now kind of doing something where we come up to the terminator line and we pull back the value from that line and use that gradient of color to say, like, okay, this is where the most intense part of the shadow is at the terminator, and then as we pull away from it can kind of suggest bounced light coming from a separate direction. But what I want to show you is that, you know, you don't always have to have it be that direction of light. It doesn't have to be the most intense here. If you're talking about a really soft lighting scheme, then you actually might want to start at the furthest point away from the light, being the darkest, and then pulling that value towards the terminator line with a really, really light touch. If we just want to like softly light this guy's face, then we'll go to like where it would be like the most intense part of the shadow. And pulling that pigment towards the terminator line. I have too much pigment on here still. I want it to be a bit softer. So until it kind of like almost just fades away. And in this case, the soft light is still coming from a direction, so it's not like you can think of this as so faint that it allows you to paint shadow wherever. It's just that the quality of the value within the shadow is going to be becoming lighter as it approaches the terminator, to kind of have the turn from one plane to the other be a softer, more gradual change. So here, in a micro sense, is the same example. The side plane of the nose, it's going to be most dark on the furthest point away from the turn, and then gradually approach that with less value as it reaches that turn. So a little bit watery there, but over here would be where it's darker, and then it just has a really soft gradient towards the termination. I tend not to shade things this way personally because I think that it's just more fun to have really strong, hard terminator lines. With this one, the goal is actually to almost not see them. The fact that we have these lines here is maybe kind of making them a little bit confusing to see. So to just draw this guy really quickly without that terminator line. So just that kind of face. The purpose of this last lesson here is that the shadow furthest away from the light source is the darkest, and that we're just pulling the value towards the termination line until it kind of just gradually transitions into the white. Okay, so that is our last example of just really soft lighting and approaching it from the end point of a shadow as opposed to the terminator line. So that concludes the lesson for today. Now let's talk about your mission, which is to shade 5 heads. Rather than drawing new heads, use the drawings that you did in 3-6 to shade. That way you're focusing more on shading than drawing a new drawing. And please shade these heads in the same way that we did together in class, where you're going to draw a ball and then shade that ball and use that as your plan for how you tackle the rest of the head. And with that, we're done with chapter 4. And moving on to chapter 5, we're going to learn more about color theory and how to blend and mix colors. Looking forward to seeing you then. Bye.